Hi, everyone. My name's Alexis Alloway. I'm a local avalanche educator based here in Bozeman, and today I'm here from the Friends of the GNFAC to give you an overview of avalanche rescue. Goals for today's talk are we are going to understand the importance of accident prevention when it comes to the backcountry. We're also going to understand why time is essential in companion rescue. And finally, by the end of today's talk, you should have a full understanding of all the different stages of companion rescue. Basically, we're getting you ready so that you can come out to the field day and practice companion rescue and have an understanding of exactly what needs to happen. So I'm going to start today's talk by emphasizing that having to do an avalanche rescue is a situation that you never want to find yourself in. Doing a rescue can be extremely challenging, and unfortunately, it doesn't always end well. So one of the key principles throughout this entire course is just emphasizing accident prevention. It's easier to stay out of trouble than to get out of trouble. Unfortunately, every year in the US, we do have people who get in serious trouble. We do experience about 27 avalanche fatalities in the US every winter. And unfortunately, we also experience some of those fatalities right here in our own backyard in Southwest Montana. So if we look at major avalanche incidents here in the Bozeman area over the last decade or so, unfortunately, we have had 20 people killed, or an average of 2 people per year for the past decade. And as you can see from this graph, they come from all different user groups, everything from skiers to snowmobilers and snow bikers to even hunters. So really anyone who's going out in the winter backcountry needs to have some avalanche awareness skills, and that includes having some rescue skills. So how do people die from avalanches? Well, unfortunately, 1 out of every 4 avalanche fatalities involves people who died from trauma. So as you're learning throughout the course, avalanches can travel really quickly, and people being tumbled down a slope, slammed into trees or rocks can definitely die from internal injuries, bleeding, spinal cord injuries, neck injuries, etc. Most avalanche victims who die do die from asphyxiation. So about 73% of fatalities are people who are completely buried and they asphyxiate underneath the snow. And then it's interesting to note that a tiny portion of fatalities are from hypothermia, although that's pretty uncommon. When we look at avalanche survival rates, this graph here shows us the probability of survival versus the duration of burial, or basically how long someone was buried under the snow. This study was a pretty comprehensive study done in Canada, where we have similar terrain here in the US. And basically what we see is that time matters a lot when someone is buried under the snow. After 15 minutes of burial, more than half of fully buried victims did die. So about 60% were dead at 15 minutes. And you can see from this curve that the more and more time we have, the longer someone's buried, the less likely they are to survive. So at 40 minutes, 90% of full burials were dead. There are some people who are able to survive being buried for longer than that if they're very lucky to get an air pocket. But it's just worth pointing out that those long burial survivals are an exception. That's not common for that to occur. So our avalanche survival curve illustrates that being able to execute a quick companion rescue is absolutely essential. And it also illustrates that search and rescue really can't help you that much if you're involved in an avalanche accident. Our search and rescue team here in Bozeman is amazing, but they are a group of volunteers, and it does take them time to get to an accident site. So while search and rescue can be really useful for medical treatment, for evacuation, or for doing body recovery, search and rescue is not going to be helpful for doing an immediate rescue of someone who's fully buried under the snow. And this is where we all need to understand that companion rescue saves lives. Me and everyone I'm going out in the backcountry with need to be able to execute companion rescues because it really is up to us. So how do we become an effective companion rescuer? We've got to get training. If you're taking this course, you're off to a great start. So we're getting training in the classroom. We're going to go out on the field day to get more training. And if you go to montanaavalanche.com and look at our education calendar, you will see that there are all kinds of different resources to help you learn and practice companion rescue skills. So that's everything from free clinics the GNFAC puts on throughout the season to more advanced rescue courses you can take with local guide companies. In addition to getting formal training, companion rescue skills are use it or lose it. So really what that means is that once you get training, you're going to want to update that training and you are going to want to practice, 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 practice. You truly can't practice too much. There are a lot of different skills involved, everything from transceiver work to probing to shoveling to first aid to evacuation to search strategies. If someone's not wearing a transceiver, the more we practice these skills, the easier they're going to come to us, especially when we find ourselves feeling pretty panicked in a real life emergency. So before we get into how to execute a companion rescue, I want to emphasize again the importance of accident prevention. So let's take a minute to reiterate some of those really important ideas. Number one, something you're learning about in this course is, I think, the most effective accident prevention tool in my kit is I make sure to do a thorough backcountry tour plan before I go out in the backcountry. So this gets me not only checking the avalanche forecast to learn about what's going on out there with the snowpack and the weather, this also kind of gets me applying that information to my tour for that day. So I'm using the avalanche forecast to identify red flags or warning signs of instability. I'm going to use the forecast to rule out terrain, especially taking note when forecasters tell you to avoid certain types of terrain features. And I'm going to make sure that I'm picking an objective that is appropriate for the given avalanche conditions. So doing all this planning ahead of time, especially at home when I'm not feeling emotional or mad cow disease or staring down at a beautiful slope is really going to help manage my human factors, and it's going to help me make better decisions. Another way I stay out of trouble, which we gave a whole nother talk about, is making sure that I go into the backcountry with the appropriate gear. Failure to have the appropriate gear, if I leave one critical thing home, like I forget my probe, that could critically and negatively alter the outcomes of an incident that happens. So you'll notice that my backcountry tour plan has an equipment checklist built into it because that's how important it is that I make sure I have every piece of essential gear. Some other things to think about to help us stay out of trouble is we want to make sure that we're building a thorough transceiver trek into our tour every single day. So in a different episode of this series, we learned all about D-Best beacon check, where we check to make sure our equipment is working properly. And then it's also really important that I'm carrying my safety gear properly. So that's wearing my transceiver correctly on my body or in my pocket. And that also means making sure that I'm zipping essential safety gear, like my shovel and my probe, inside my backpack where it can't get ripped off my pack in the event of an avalanche. Another thing to think about is making sure that you are wearing releasable bindings. In the event that I'm caught in an avalanche, I want my skis to release. If they don't, that can lead to serious injuries of my legs, and it can also drag me down and lead to a deeper burial in the avalanche. So releasable bindings are a really important part of helping me stay out of trouble. And then finally, one of the most important things we can do is when we find ourselves in the backcountry and we're going into avalanche terrain, it's really important that we utilize safe travel practices. So what that means is when we're traveling across or skiing down avalanche terrain, we want to make sure that we're only exposing one person to the avalanche hazard at a time. This way, if there is an avalanche, only one person is caught, minimizing the number of victims, and that's going to maximize the number of rescuers that I have to go help that person. So my safe travel practices involve skiing one at a time or crossing slopes one at a time while everyone else watches and spots from a safe zone. And with safe travel practices, I do want to take a moment to point out that as easy as this sounds in theory, it's kind of hard to do in real life. And we see that when we look at accident data, both nationally and locally here in Southwest Montana. A look at our major avalanche incidents here in Southwest Montana over the past decade shows that in 50% of our major incidents, we had multiple people caught in the avalanche at the same time. So this is some evidence that we're not doing a good job with our safe travel practices. So how do we do better? Spacing. When I'm out in the backcountry with my friends, I will definitely stop before we start crossing a slope or skiing to verbalize exactly what kind of spacing we want, where our safe zones are, and have an escape plan as well. How far of spacing is enough is going to vary depending on a lot of different factors. The simple answer is just to say, how far is enough? It's more than you think. Get off each other's butts, give each other some extra space. Okay, so we talked about how we stay out of trouble with proper gear, trip planning, proper safety devices that we're using appropriately, proper spacing in our safe travel practices. Now let's talk about what to do when things go wrong. One thing we do need to address is what you should do if you're caught in an avalanche. Your instant reaction when you realize that an avalanche is happening is to get out of harm's way. So that could look like trying to ski off a slab that's releasing underneath you. Jump uphill if a slab is releasing directly beneath your feet and you can get off it that way. Or if you see an avalanche coming from above, try to get out of the way. Another thing you can do is try to self-arrest and grab onto a tree and hold on for dear life to avoid getting caught up in the avalanche. And that may sound kind of impossible to have that actually be effective, but looking at our accidents over the past decade here in Southwest Montana, we actually do see that in 15% of our major incidents, people survived the avalanche because they were able to either get off the moving slab, or in 11% of the cases, they were actually able to self-arrest and grab onto a tree and prevent being caught and carried. If you find yourself being caught and carried, that is not an ideal situation. If you're wearing an airbag, you want to instantaneously deploy that airbag. And regardless of whether you have an airbag or not, you do want to try to ditch your skis. You're probably not going to be able to intentionally release them, but hopefully your DIN settings and releasable bindings will work in your favor. And you're also going to want to ditch your poles because this equipment can actually drag you down. As I'm being tumbled down the hill, if I have the ability to make swimming motions with my arms, I want to do that. I want to fight for my life to try to keep myself on top of the debris. As the debris starts to come to rest around me and things start slowing down, if I'm able to put an arm in front of my face to try to create an air pocket, that's ideal. If I'm able to reach a hand up, wherever up may be, to hopefully have it stick out of the snow, that would be ideal. But we also need to recognize that avalanche debris can harden instantly when it stops moving. So you may not be able to deliberately do these things. And basically, if you find yourself buried by an avalanche, at that point, you are not going to be able to dig yourself out because you're probably not going to be able to move. And really what you need to do at that point is stay as calm as possible and wait for your companions to rescue you. So as we can see and start to imagine, this is absolutely a situation we don't ever want to find ourselves in. Okay, if you are in the role of rescuer, let's give a quick overview of what needs to happen. So number one is before we go rushing into the rescue, we need to take a brief pause to do a quick assessment of scene safety and just have some leadership where someone's communicating what needs to happen and who's doing what. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to move into our search phase. So we're going to use transceivers to locate the victim and then use our probe to pinpoint exactly where they are. We're then going to shovel snow until we reach their airway and get them extricated from the snow. And then finally, we are going to need to be prepared to do some first aid. And then we're going to need to get that person out of the backcountry. We're going to need to have an evacuation plan. So now we're going to go through all these different stages in a little bit more detail. Okay, leadership. When the feces hit the fan, it is really important that somebody steps up and takes charge. And even though time is of the essence, it is really important to take 30 seconds to just get the group together and come up with a plan and have some clear leadership and communication. So slow is smooth and smooth is fast when it comes to an emergency situation like this. When I assume a leadership role, I like to use this alone checklist to kind of do a little witness interview or a scene size up to make sure that we have a plan before we kind of charge into action. So the A stands for additional avalanche hazard. Basically, I want to think about scene safety. In a companion rescue, if an avalanche just happened, most of the time it's likely going to be safe to perform a rescue where it just happened because your hazard has now been removed. It's kind of like ski patrol performing avalanche mitigation work. So I do a quick scene safety, thinking about additional avalanches. Next thing I want to do is establish the last scene point of the person or people who are missing. The reason I want to do this is because I want to narrow down my search area. If I know they were last seen at a tree halfway down the slope, I now know we don't need to search above that tree and waste time there. Oh, I want to think about whether or not to call for outside help. A lot of times we will want to call for outside help at some point, but probably not right away. And the reason I don't want to call right away is because it takes time to make that emergency call. And someone who's buried and missing under the snow is having an airway emergency. As we've established, we don't have a lot of time to get to that airway. I guess the few times I would consider calling for outside help right away would be if I was afraid of losing cell service when I ski downhill, let's say, or if I find myself in a large group situation where there are plenty of resources, we can totally send someone to call for help at that point. Okay, another thing I want to establish is figuring out how many people are missing because that's going to impact my search technique. And then very important, before people start moving around, we want to address electronic interference. So we want to make sure that any devices or outerwear we're wearing that can interfere with our search, electronics need to be turned off. I want to stow them in my backpack. And then I also want to make sure that all the rescuers who are on the scene, all my companions, that everyone has their transceiver turned to search. Because if someone's accidentally transmitting, that can totally screw up our search and cost us a bunch of valuable time. With my witness interview, I practice this alone checklist or acronym every single time I do a beacon search. That's the only way I'm going to remember this stuff in the event of a real situation. So memorize the alone checklist, start using it now, and we'll use it more on the field day when we practice. Okay, once we've taken a moment to assess scene safety, go through our alone checklist, and establish some leadership, we're now going to start our search. We are going to start searching at the point last seen, And the first phase of our transceiver search is called the signal search, where I am going to methodically zigzag my way down through the avalanche path and debris, looking for a signal. I do want to keep in mind the effective range of my transceiver. It can only pick up a signal usually within 50 meters or so. So I want to make sure that my search strip width is well within this range. I don't want the strips to be too wide because it would really suck to potentially miss their signal. And with my signal search, I want to move very, very quickly and methodically. Okay, at some point, I'm doing my little zigzag pattern, and I am all of a sudden going to notice that my transceiver starts flashing and beeping. This is where I'm now entering the course search. So the course search is when we pick up that transmitting signal. And my transceiver is going to start telling me two things. It's going to flash a directional arrow that's showing me the direction that the signal is coming from. And it's also going to give me a number, which is telling me my distance to the transmitting transceiver. This diagram on your screen shows you a rough illustration of what the flux lines that come out of our transceivers look like. So you can see they kind of almost look like butterfly wings, these elliptical shapes coming out of the transceiver. And it's important to understand that because it affects where you're going to go. So when my course search happens, I start getting numbers. I want to basically keep that directional arrow centered as much as possible. And I want to make sure that my numbers are decreasing because that means I'm taking the nice, short, direct way into the transceiver as shown by this pink arrow. If I notice that my numbers are increasing, that means I'm being pulled around the outer longer part of the flux line, and I don't want to go that way because it's going to take longer. So if your numbers are increasing, the solution to that problem is you're going to stop, you're going to turn completely in the opposite direction, 180 degrees, and then continue going. So for my course search, I am moving pretty quickly, just keeping that arrow centered, making sure my numbers are getting smaller and smaller. And then when I hit about 10 meters, I want to start slowing down to a walk, making sure that I'm coming in with my directional arrow fully centered and engaged. Okay, the most difficult part of transceiver search is the final part, which we call the find search, which is the searching that occurs when we're within about 3 meters of the transmitting signal. So when I get to 3 meters, I do want to make sure I take my skis off if I haven't already. And I want to make sure that I slow down and I want to get my transceiver at ground level or as close to ground level as I possibly can. At this point, I am now going to keep my transceiver oriented in the same direction. So I'm not going to turn it around in different directions. If it's facing this way, it's going to stay facing that way. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my transceiver along the line, look for the smallest reading. So let's say it's 2.6, as you see on the screen. I'm then going to create a line perpendicular to that, and I'm going to move my transceiver along that line, also looking for the smallest reading. So now you'll notice my smallest reading is 1.3 meters. Then once I get the smallest reading, I'm going to intersect that line perpendicular once again, looking for the smallest reading. So in this case, you'll notice that 1.3 is my smallest reading or my closest reading in 2 different directions. That is my low point where I am going to now get my probe out to pinpoint exactly where the buried subject is located. So I get my low reading in both directions. To pinpoint with my probe, I'm going to assemble my probe and keep my gloves on. I'm going to want to make sure that I insert my probe into the snow at a 90-degree angle. And I don't want to like jab the probe really aggressively. I'm going to insert it firmly and smoothly into the ground. And in hard debris, it's important to keep my hands low on the probe. If I put them really high up and apply pressure, it could actually break my probe. So I'm gonna probe starting at that low reading. And if I don't get a probe strike immediately, I am now going to methodically spiral outward, inserting my probe with 25 centimeter or 10-inch spacing. So I start at the low point, spiral outward. I could make a box pattern. All that matters is that you're pretty tight on your spacing and that you're consistent. Soon I will get a probe strike. And when I get a probe strike, I will want to make sure I keep the probe in place. So now that we've located the buried subject with the probe, we know exactly where they are. Now it's time to shovel. And shoveling through avalanche debris is arguably the most physically difficult and time-consuming part of an avalanche rescue. Our average burial depth of accidents here in Southwest Montana is 106 centimeters deep. If you have to shovel that much snow, you're looking at shoveling 2,000 to 3,000 pounds of snow. And it's really important that you don't just wing it. You need to learn and use proper shoveling technique. So we have two goals when we're shoveling out an avalanche victim. Number one is we want to reach their airway as soon as possible. Secondly, in addition to reaching their airway, we also want to create a workable platform where we can pull that person out from under the snow, kind of to the side, and then we have a platform that we can use to perform CPR potentially, or first aid, or potentially create a shelter around them while we administer first aid and try to keep them stable. So with shoveling, you will have a chance to practice this and learn about proper technique during our field day. Once we are done shoveling, in some ways, we still have potentially a long ways to go and a lot of challenges to deal with when it comes to first aid and evacuation. And really what we need to do is just going to depend on what we find. You do need to be prepared that you might uncover someone who's not breathing and doesn't have a pulse. And you absolutely need to have an understanding of CPR. And even kind of when to give CPR, when not to give CPR. And you're also gonna need to have some pretty good first aid skills. You can definitely anticipate dealing with trauma, potentially broken bones, potentially head injuries. Anyone who's been tumbled by an avalanche, we should be taking spinal precautions for spinal injuries. So this is where really anybody who's going into the winter backcountry absolutely should have wilderness first aid training as a minimum. The other kind of challenging thing about companion rescue is what we do with someone who's severely injured or maybe not breathing and doesn't have a pulse or appears to be deceased after we uncover them. So this is where I can't emphasize enough that search and rescue is your friend, and this is somewhere where they really can help out. So once you reach a victim's airway, the airway emergency is gone if they're getting oxygen again, and that is a great time to call for help from search and rescue. And the sooner you can place that call, the better, because it does take time for SAR teams to reach an incident site. In the event that you can't call search and rescue, or even if you can, you also do need to be prepared that it's going to take some time for search and rescue to come in, and you are going to need to keep your injured companion warm. So having the right gear to provide some warmth to someone who's potentially hypothermic, which can really be exacerbated by trauma in the winter, and even being able to have the skills to create an emergency snow shelter are pretty essential for managing the aftermath of an avalanche. Okay, some other situations to be aware of. Unfortunately, we can have companion rescues that involve multiple burials. There are different ways we can address this situation. It's not something we're going to address on our fundamentals field day, but you should just be aware that there are different ways to solve this problem, whether that's using special multiple variable functions in our transceiver, or even just treating multiple burials as a series of single burials. Another situation you may find yourself in, I hope not, but it can happen, is you could find yourself in a situation where you have to search for someone who's not wearing a transceiver. You would think this doesn't happen anymore, but in the last decade, we have had 4 fatalities here in Southwest Montana that were involving people who weren't wearing transceivers. So if you find yourself in this situation, pretty much the most important thing you can do right away is to do a thorough search of the avalanche zone looking for clues. In an analysis of all our incidents here in Southwest Montana over the past decade, in 20% of avalanche accidents, a buried victim did have a body part, a backpack, or some kind of clue visible at the snow surface. So that is your greatest hope of saving someone's life, is that maybe their hand is sticking out or their boot is sticking out. When you find clues in the snow, let's say you see a ski, for example, it's really important that you manage them properly. So when I see a clue, the first thing I want to do is pick it up. If I see a glove, it may have a hand in it, I may discover as I go to pick it up. Once I pick up that clue, if there is no body attached to it, it's super important that I leave that clue where I found it. Because if search and rescue does come to help, which is pretty likely, it's really important that they know exactly where all the surface clues are. So leave clues in place. And then really at this point, we are going to want to do some spot probing of high likelihood burial areas. So if someone's missing without a transceiver, some likely burial areas would include probing on the uphill side of any trees or rocks or mounds that might slow down or stop a body tumbling down the hill. I do want to probe around my surface clues that I find, both the location of the clue as well as immediately above and below the clue. I do want to probe any abrupt transitions or flat benches or gullies and depressions that are high likelihood deposition zones. And I also do want to spot probe the toe of the debris where many people wind up. If there's an incident that involves a snowmobile, remember to probe underneath the snowmobile, because sometimes people get pinned under their sled. And you're also going to want to do some spot probing in line with that snowmobile, both uphill of it and downhill of it. And when it comes to spot probing, you don't want to spend too much time in any one place. So you want to move quickly. Definitely keep your eyes out for additional clues and stay situationally aware. You only want to spend a minute or 2 per clue. And with your probe spacing, you don't need to be as precise as when we're spiral probing during a transceiver search. You can use more generous, like 50-centimeter spacing between where you're inserting the probe. If spot probing doesn't work, we are in a really bad situation. We definitely want to make sure we've called for help at this point because we absolutely need it. Once we've exhausted spot probing, our next step is to do some miniature probe lines in those same high likelihood areas that we just spot probed. So a probe line is a little bit different than spot probing in that it is more precise and methodical. With a probe line, my probers are going to line up facing uphill, and they're going to stand next to each other. They can put their arms out to the sides and line up with wrist to wrist spacing between them. And then having a probe line leader to give commands is really helpful. And the leader can essentially instruct them to use a 3-hole per step technique where they probe left, they probe center, and they probe right. So each person does that, takes one step forward, and that probe line is going to work its way through those high likelihood areas, and hopefully we will find our buried subject. Some common challenges when it comes to companion rescue. We definitely see these main challenges when it comes to teaching these courses. Number one is just a lack of practice. We see this where leadership and communication can be really poor. We see people struggling with their gear, and it's evident. So the more you can practice, the more you don't have to worry about this common challenge, and the more confident you're going to feel when you have to do a companion rescue in real life. Another common challenge is poor leadership. So this is something where the people who I like to go out and tour in the backcountry with, I definitely make it a point to get out and practice with them several times throughout the season, because it's not just about the technical skills, it's also about how we communicate and about knowing each other's strengths and weaknesses. And finally, unfortunately, another common challenge in real life rescue is just people not having the right gear, whether that's people not having avalanche transceivers, people having, let's say, a broken probe that's not working, etc. So in review from today's PowerPoint, I hope you've realized that companion rescue is not something you ever want to have to do in real life, but it is a skill that you absolutely need to know. And remember that once again, accident prevention really is our best risk management plan. It's easier to stay out of trouble than get out of trouble. When it comes to those companion rescue skills, they are use it or lose it. So we do need to take the initiative to practice as much as possible and to practice continually throughout the season. And finally, we look forward to seeing you all out to practice in the field. So you're going to begin this journey. We'll do a couple hours of companion rescue practice as part of the field day. From there, it's going to be up to you to continue that education and to take the initiative to practice with your friends. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. I also hope that you consider signing up to get the avalanche forecast delivered to your inbox every day. Not only do you get the forecast, but you also get great information about upcoming educational events and opportunities. So thank you all for being here, and we'll see you out in the field.